So good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining the third webinar of the ICAT Assessment Guide webinar series. The purpose of these webinars is to help you better understand how you can utilize the guide and benefit from their application. So improving policy design and implementation, inform target settings such as NDCs, track progress towards these targets, provide information for reporting domestically or internationally, and attracting finance by demonstrating the results of effective policies. These assessment guides are just one tool from ICAT's toolbox that will help you do so. I'd like to switch to the next slide and bring everybody's attention to the fact that this is a part of a series and there are upcoming webinars, as you will see. Please visit climateactiontransparency.org to register for those. And as you'll see, in 2 weeks' time, we have another webinar on the forest assessment guide. If you would like to view the guides also, please visit climateactiontransparency.org, where all the guides and supporting information and tools are available for you. And importantly so, the production and the rollout of these guides wouldn't have been possible without the enduring support and commitment by our donor partners, as well as our supporting and implementing partners across the board, as you see there. So, as I said, in terms of the optimal way to enjoy this webinar is that please remain in listen-only mode. Questions and comments on your right-hand side in the dashboard, you'll be able to insert those. I do encourage you to do it as we go, so along the different presentations and sessions that you'll hear, so that at the end we can collate them all and we get them to the panelists for you. Today's webinar is being recorded and we will share them very shortly after the webinar with you, along with the presentations, and also at the end when we'll package them as a resource for future reference. Please stick around until the end. We do have an evaluation form so we can continue improving on the format and delivery of these webinars that we have for you. And if you have any technical issues throughout the webinar, please contact Beth Elliott at WRA, as you see on the screen. We have some really exciting speakers for you today. We have Mr. Henning Musto, who's the Director of ICAT and drives the initiative to help countries around the world put in place effective and ambitious climate policies needed to achieve the objectives of the Paris Agreement. We have Cynthia Elliott, who's an associate with the Global Climate Program at WRI and focuses her work on transparency and strengthening climate change mitigation actions and building capacity in developing countries. She is also the co-author of this very assessment guide, the Nonstate and Subnational Action Guide. We have Mr. Santiago Uribe Fuentes, who is from the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia, and as the leader of the Cities and Climate Change National Strategy, he's the focal point of the ICAT project and responsible to link it with the national process. We also have Tom Sears, a research analyst with WRI US program, where he leads the efforts to assess and quantify the impact of state and local impact climate policies, and is also the core member of the Team for America's Pledge, the initiative that you will hear from today. Ashwini Hingna is the manager with the climate program in WRI India, and she led the implementation of the ICAT non-state and subnational action guidance pilot in India, which was conducted in partnership with the Confederation of Indian Industry. And to complete the set of expert panelists, we have Swithin, who's a policy analyst at New Climate Institute, working primarily on issues in non-state action, climate governance, and country NDC support. And he indirectly supported these methodology developments for the ICAT non-state action guidance. And now leads the development of the tool to implement the guidance along with other new climate colleagues. The agenda for today, as you can see on your screen, we've got first up is Henning, who will outline the importance of assessing the impacts of subnational and non-state action in our collective pursuit for a strong transparency framework, followed by Cynthia, who delves into how you can utilize the assessment guide and everything else you need to know to potentially start using it. We have Santiago, who's going to share with you some experiences of the Ministry of Environment and Sustainable Development in Colombia when they applied the ICAT Assessment Guide, followed by Tom, who's presenting America's Pledge, the roadmap for rapid and comprehensive US emissions reductions based on subnational efforts, followed by Ashwini, which she'll give an insight into how the guide was applied to assess the emission reduction impact of voluntary business commitments in India. And to round it off again is Swithin with an exclusive look into the accessible Excel-based tool designed to help you apply the ICAT non-state and subnational action guide, followed by Q&A. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Mr. Henning Worcester, who is, as you can see, in our room here. And I'd like to welcome Mr. Worcester to the stage.
Thank you very much, Josh, and good afternoon, or good morning, or perhaps good evening to the many colleagues connected. Really happy to have so many experts again on the line, and this is the third webinar in our series, and today we launch a guide which really picks up a very special topic, a topic that you wouldn't have heard about some 20 years ago, but a topic which then has gained a lot of interest and attention over the last couple of years, and I'll explain a little bit why, and also how this guide fits into the overall series. So let me give you some background on why the ICAT assessment guides were actually created and what they aim to achieve. The assessment guides were prepared to support policymakers and those that assist them to assess a broad range of policy impacts in implementing the Paris Agreement. Conducting such an assessment can help in three ways. First of all, it can help directly improve the effectiveness of policy design. Secondly, and this is very relevant here, it can help to engage all relevant stakeholders across all sectors, but also across different levels of governance, so from the national down to the local level. And thirdly, the guides can help support accountability. This includes reporting at the global level, but it also includes accountability at the national level, and again, stakeholder engagement through transparency and accountability. So three buzzwords: effectiveness, integration, and accountability. And let me now explain to you what that means for the guide that we are launching here today. So the number that you see here, 26,042, is the number of actions being carried out as registered on the UNFCCC Global Climate Action Portal, formerly known as NASCA. So it's a very significant number, and behind it you have the number of actors that are actually engaged in taking or committing to these actions. And this includes non-state actors like companies, it includes NGOs, and it includes subnational actors such as the city of Bogota, which you see here in the background, and then of course regions. Ignoring these actions will likely lead to a significant underestimation of possible emission reductions. So that was the main reason for developing methodology that allows to make these actions visible and to allow an integration into efforts to raise mitigation ambition at regional, global, and national level. The purpose of this guide is to assess the contribution of subnational and non-state actors. And this can be done either in the form of aggregation, to just inform decision makers at various levels, in the public or private level, or at the local and national level, or it can support the integration to actually include subnational and non-state action in planning climate strategies. And that includes, of course, planning work on policy documents like the NDCs. And then to design the underlying policies that can support implementation. So let me explain that with further reference to the policy cycle. What you see here is a stylized policy cycle from the start to an evaluation. And the ICAT assessment guides can be used at various stages, either ex ante when defining policy objectives, selecting a policy, or designing that policy. And it can be applied during implementation to track progress. And finally, it can be applied ex post to evaluate impacts to feed into the next policy cycle. Now, the non-state actor subnational guide is somewhat different from the other ICAT assessment guides, as it focuses on an ex ante assessment. But it can also be used to monitor contributions by non-state and subnational actors. Ex post assessments can, for instance, be used to check the results of ex ante assessments by monitoring the performance of actions over time, verify baselines and underlying assumptions, and guide future strategy development. Ex post assessments can also be applied separately from on an ongoing basis as new actors or new non-state subnational actions are implemented and added to the assessment. And above all, these assessments can be utilized to inform good policy making at the national level, to actually integrate the potential of what non-state and subnational actors can contribute into policy development and then drive ambition in target setting by pushing the envelope. With that, let me explain how this guide fits into the overall toolbox that ICAT is putting in place through the assessment guides we are launching. In dark blue on this slide, you see the 8 assessment guides. In the middle, there are the 3 guides that are covering cost-cutting aspects, including the one we are launching today, and 2 others that we launched 2 weeks ago, covering sustainable development and transformational change. On the left-hand side, you see the greenhouse gas impact assessment guides covering various sectors: energy, transport, forestry, agriculture. And on the right-hand side, in light blue, you see 2 process guides, which are also very important and complementary, covering stakeholder participation and technical review. ICAT recommends the application of several guides in parallel. So, for instance, a country can choose to focus on the renewable energy uptake in cities and industry, applying the non-state and subnational action guide, then do an assessment of renewable energy policy with the renewable energy methodology, and use the transformational change and sustainable development guide to assess impacts of action on transformational change, and also the sustainable development impacts associated with that action, to integrate action into national development plan. And then, of course, ensuring sound stakeholder participation using the stakeholder participation guide and technical review to ensure robustness of the assessment complements the work done. This is, of course, a choice by the user and by the countries. ICAT supports countries in building up the transparency framework needed for such assessments and then in conducting the assessments, and helps countries to prepare for effective policy processes domestically to then be able to fulfill also their reporting obligations under the Paris Agreement. We are currently working with 3 countries to link national action to the subnational level, and you will hear about one of them shortly. You will then also hear about some of the experience of the application of the assessment guide already in the past. So with that, let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Henning. So according to the agenda, we'll pass on over the microphone to Cynthia, who will present. And while her presentation is coming up, I'd like to just highlight, if anyone wants to access the introductory webinar to the assessment guides, it gives a bit broader overview of all the assessment guides. Please visit climateactiontransparency.org or find us on YouTube. So, and please take it away, Cynthia. Thank you.
Thanks, Josh, and thanks, Henning. Very happy to be here today. My name is Cynthia. I'm a Climate Program Associate at WRI, and this has been a long process in coming, so we're glad to see this guide finally launched today. The methodology in this guide, the development of the methodology, was led by New Climate Institute, and we worked with other partners as well, including CDP and the Climate Group in the development guide. So lots of collaboration led to this this document, and we're happy to share it with you. I'm going to be just going through briefly some of the steps involved in applying the guide, and hopefully give you a little taste of what this entails, and that will be followed by the more specific examples. So hope this is useful to you. So first, in terms of the purpose of the guide, the methodology contained provides steps for users to identify, quantify, and aggregate the potential greenhouse gas emission reduction impact of non-state and subnational actions, and integrate them into mitigation targets, projections, and scenarios. And this may support policy development, policy evaluation, and target setting. As Henning noted, this guide is specific to ex-ante assessment and focuses only on greenhouse gas emission reduction potential. The premise for undertaking such an assessment is that national governments and non-state and subnational action can mutually reinforce each other. This relationship is essentially a two-way street. So when national governments set climate targets or adopt new policies, they send signals to and influence and inform the actions of non-state and subnational actors. And likewise, at the same time, when non-state and subnational actors adopt targets and policies, they contribute to meeting goals adopted by national governments. Undertaking an assessment with the use of this guide can help unpack this virtuous interdependency in a country, shining a light on the potential for greater climate action when national governments and regional and state and local governments and businesses all work together. So what are some of the questions that the guide can help answer? We have a few on the screen. I'll just walk through some. There are different levels of difficulty with applying some of these, some are more complicated than others. But that's sort of at a base level, the guide can help look at what non-state and subnational climate actions are occurring in a country. You can look at which of these actions or sums of actions of various stakeholders may have climate impact in a country. How big is the impact? What is the relationship of that impact to the NDC? So how can non-state and subnational actions contribute to meeting or overachieving NDC mitigation targets? Which actions reflect ambition or go beyond existing policies, and by how much? And how can non-state and subnational actions enable new, more ambitious NDC mitigation targets to be set? So there are 7 basic steps in this, this guide, and I'm going to walk through them briefly during this presentation. So one of the first steps really is to determine the objective of the assessment. I just noted the guide can answer numerous questions and can thus support several different objectives. We'll hear about some of these examples from later presenters, so I won't go into detail here. There are some examples in the presentation, but there are some key points that users should consider when designing the objective. A critical question is, well, what do you want to do with the results of the assessment? Is the assessment meant to inform the NDC process, or identify further opportunities in key sectors or actor groups, or are you looking to just showcase and encourage further action? Another critical point to consider is how difficult it may be to collect information, and what information and data do you already have available that may help inform the objective. And then you can also consider the timeline, how much time you have available, and the key assessment principles of relevance, completeness, consistency, accuracy, comparability, and transparency, as these will guide the process. So once you have a clear objective in mind, you can begin to determine the assessment boundary. Here we have a figure from the guide which shows some of the areas that you would need to consider when defining this boundary. The assessment guide will help users identify specific components of their assessment boundary, including which sectors and subsectors to focus on, which actor groups, whether you want to look at all actors or just cities or businesses, which action types, if you want to look at policies and measures and projects, or just greenhouse gas targets, or also non-greenhouse gas targets. The types of indirect emissions and which greenhouse gas emissions to include. And users should also consider the assessment period. So here's just a hypothetical example of someone who's used the guide and has determined an assessment boundary. So in this case, the user opted to look at the economy-wide set of actions. So for all sectors, they've also chosen to look at all actor groups, both cities and corporations and state-level action. They want to look at all action types, so including policies, measures, and all types of targets. They've included international collaborative initiatives, so many non-state and subnational actions have committed to action at the international scale through initiatives such as science-based targets, and there are steps involved in incorporating those actions in the assessment as well. This obviously has implications for full scope of greenhouse gas emissions, as all actions may fall into various greenhouse gas categories. And they're looking to explore direct emissions and scope 2 emissions. So that's just an example. Once you have your objective and assessment boundary in mind, you can put together a list of relevant non-state and subnational actions. Ideally, users can build on and leverage existing databases and networks and incorporate what's already been collected to avoid duplicating existing data collection efforts. There are international data sets, such as those on the Global Climate Action Portal, which Henning also mentioned, but many national governments and domestic NGOs may also have relevant databases. Here on the screen is a table from the guide, which helps explain which types of information you would want to collect from each action and each actor. At this point, as you begin to collect data, it may become clear that not all actions will actually be relevant or useful or usable in the assessment. Some data may be missing. For example, if an actor has a target but has not specified the time frame, or if the outcome is not clearly specified or quantitative, and users will need to consider whether or not to include these actions in the assessment. So basically, users need to do a suitability assessment to determine which actions are relevant to the assessment objective. Through this suitability assessment, it's helpful to consider the potential magnitude of impact. Do you think the action will have major or moderate or minor impact? And what is the likelihood that that action will be implemented and achieved? Is there a legal basis for that activity? Does the actor have a good track record of implementation? Are there sufficient resources? Are they already taking steps? The guide will walk you through some of these questions to determine whether or not you should include all of the actions in your assessment. And at this point, you would have sufficient information to conduct a landscape analysis. This can help you make sense of the data that you've already collected. And here we have some examples from the America's Pledge case, which we'll hear from Tom later on. But these figures just help to visualize the number of actors and the types of actions taking place in a country. So they may be a useful step in the process. Next, you'll want to list the relevant national policies and actions, and this will depend on the assessment objective. This information will be used later to determine any overlaps with non-state and subnational actions in order to avoid double counting. And this can be done in a few different ways, which I'll describe shortly. And here again is a template for some of the information that you would want to collect on these national climate mitigation policies and actions. Once you have both the non-state subnational action and the national action data collected, you're going to want to start to harmonize non-state and subnational actions. So here we have the steps in this process. This is the first part of the impact assessment process, and it's necessary to ensure that you're comparing apples to apples and that all actions are in the same common metric. There are a few different steps involved, but it's helpful to go through the process for each sector separately included in the assessment boundary. Non-state and subnational climate actions include a variety of target types and metrics, and there may be differences in the time frame of their targets, the geographical boundary, and the scope of emissions targeted, which can make comparisons difficult. So users will need to translate the collected information on non-state and subnational actions into comparable forms for further analysis. For some actions, users may need to do some calculations to determine the potential impact of each effort in a common metric. For example, if you're using greenhouse gas emissions reduced, but this metric can depend on the sectors included in the assessment boundary. So here's an example. So in the next step, users actually need to determine the potential emission reductions. So in this case, you have a company in the energy supply sector with a target to increase renewable energy to 25% by 2030, with a baseline of 0 renewable energy in 2005. In 2005, the base year emissions were 9 million tons CO2 equivalent, entirely coming from fossil fuel electricity generation. So assuming the action is fully implemented in 2030, only 75% of electricity is generated from fossil fuels. So you can calculate an emissions reduction of 2.25 million tons CO2 equivalent from this action. It's important to note that all users should record their assumptions made during this process. Next, users will need to assess the overlaps between actions, and this really is to ensure that there's no double counting of impact. In order to assess overlaps, users should first identify the relationships between actions. Users can go sector by sector and determine the potential overlaps. Calculating overlaps can be one of the most complicated steps, but essentially there are three main types of overlaps. Full overlap, where one action is within the same emissions pool of another, so there's no additional effect. For example, if you have a city with a greenhouse gas emissions target and that city resides in a state that also has a greenhouse gas emissions target, it can be assumed that there is some overlap there. There's also partial overlap, where there may be some additional effect depending on the level of ambition. So in that same case, if the state has they both have greenhouse gas emission targets, but the city in that case has a much higher greenhouse gas emissions target, you could assume there might be some additional effect. And then also no overlap. So where actions do not occur within the same emissions pool, they may be considered additional and can be added together in the aggregation step. So at this point, users will need to calculate the potential overlap quantities considering these actions. And here we have an example of overlap calculations. This again coming from America's Pledge, where two states, State A and State B, have energy efficiency targets that would result in 1 terawatt-hour and 2 terawatt-hours of energy savings, respectively. In each state, at least one city has its own energy savings goal. So on the left side, for the city in State A, the city's utility is excluded from the compliance with the state's policy. So we can assume that there is no overlap, and you can add the city and state level impacts. On the right-hand side in State B, the city is located within a utility region that must comply with the state's goal, so you can assume that there is overlap. In this case, the city's impact would contribute to the state's target, and the aggregate is actually equal just to the state's impact. There's no single approach to assessing overlaps that will fit all situations, and quantifying overlaps often requires several assumptions, so this is just a simplified example. Users may find it helpful to consult with sector-specific experts to determine reasonable conservative assumptions during this process. Depending on the assessment objective, users may decide to aggregate the impacts accounting for overlaps within the assessment boundary to arrive at the overall impact of non-state and subnational actions in terms of potential greenhouse gas emissions reduced by the chosen timeframe. Users can also consider developing different scenarios for different levels of ambition in non-state and subnational actions, which can be compared with the estimated impact. This is done by assuming either an increase in ambition compared with existing actions or an increase in the number of actors. So this is just an example diagram that shows what the aggregate impacts would add up to, and then shows the potential for a few different scenarios that users can consider. Depending on the user capabilities and the assessment objective, it's also possible to consider using existing models to integrate the results of aggregation into existing projections. Those that may already have national policies and socioeconomic programs included in them. They may also already include non-state and subnational actions, so users will need to be careful about avoiding double counting in those circumstances. In this case, users can also consider developing different scenarios, and we'll hear about some of those examples from some of the other presenters later on. So as a final step, it's very important to ensure appropriate documentation, and users can then apply the results. Users should consider clearly documenting the results of the assessment, all assumptions and decisions made, as well as recording process-related details, including data sources, as this will really facilitate repeat assessments in the future and help provide sufficient transparency. Repeat assessments could be used to track the progress of non-state and subnational actions over time. In addition, I'm not going to go into great details here as we need to move on to the next presenters, but the results can be distributed to relevant stakeholders to inform policy design and processes. So With that, I'll hand things back over to you, Josh. Thank you.
Unmuted.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That is a really comprehensive guide, both in terms of the content of it and thank you for the delivery of it. And we're moving now to Santiago, who should also just be loading up his presentation as we speak. Yeah, and if you have any questions, as I said, that was a pretty comprehensive presentation. So please, you can access the actual documents in the dashboard you see on your right-hand side if you need to revert back to those to pose your questions. So it's all yours, Santiago. Thank you very much. No, you're unmuted. Just 1 second.
Okay. Right now?
Yeah, now we can hear you. Perfect. Yeah, now we can hear you. Perfect.
Thank you, Josh. Also, Henning and Cynthia for those great presentations. I'm really very happy to be here as a representative of Colombia, and happy to work with these great allies as ICAT and WR in the implementation of the guide. What we are going to present is our case in Colombia and the implementing of the ICAT's non-state and subnational guide. And let's see, let me just here. Okay, are you seeing my presentation?
Perfectly now.
Yes. So Colombia understands the impacts of climate change. These are a photography of our snowy Colombian peaks. This is the Nevado de Ruiz and the impacts of the climate change. And this one is the National Natural Park El Cucuy. So we have been working on the climate change because we understand the impacts that is going to happen to Colombia. So that's the reason we present on 2015 a very comprehensive national determining contribution, that is the commitment of Colombia to the Paris Agreement. This national entity is based on national circumstances, especially because we see the adaptation as a national priority. We understand that for Colombia going on and going further on the climate change measures, it needs to be very focused on adaptation. Even our global emissions are around 0.57%. We understand that we need to give our commitment to the other countries. Our economy is a growing economy with challenges and trying to overcome poverty, but we really understand the importance to have international support to strengthen the commitments on climate change. The national inventory show us that our main challenges are on the forestry line, because represents almost 33% of the national emissions. But with having this in mind, we understand also that other sectors are very important to convert our economy to a low carbon economy. So that's the reason we really understand the importance of the climate change for Colombia, and we try to make alliance with different actors to have this commitment. So in this time, after we launched our NDC, we also in 2015 we also try to make our plan, our development plan based on the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Then in 2017, Also, we launched our climate change national policy. That is really a good document to implement the climate change actions at national level and subnational levels. And in 2018, I think it was a great year because we launched our climate change law, also the national carbon tax, and we also, from the Ministry of the Environment, have the MRV national regulation. Those regulations and policies were very good and very important for our country because established the base to start local actions, initiative commitments on the territories at the national level to implement our NDC. In 2019, we start with that. So talking about climate change horizons, it is important to have that this government is going to go until 2022. So we have the National Development Plan that includes some certain goals and commitments to the climate change. But on 2013 is the horizon of the National Development Contribution, or NDC. So we are working on that. But it's very important to highlight that we also commit with the long-term strategies to achieve climate change efforts, and we call it the E2015. That is this long-term strategy to fight climate change, and its horizon is to 2050. So our current mitigation established that we, in a business as usual scenario, Colombia will have on 2013 335 million tons of CO2. So the commitment on the mitigation area is to reduce 20% on 2013. That means 66 million tons of CO2. That also we are conditioned to reduce 30% if we have international cooperation on doing that. So this is important because right now we are in the process of the NDC update in this year, and this is kind of the roadmap. We understand that we need to go further in three very important ways. That is adaptation, mitigation, and means of implementation. This is important because we try and we are going to follow the guiding principles, like use the best available information in the country, try to progress and not reverse. Also, Colombia is very, it plays a role of leadership in the transparency group, so we need to continue with this leadership and consistency with the work done. We need to have this consistency. Another guiding principles that are very important to this process, but the sequences of the steps are a very long and comprehensive. So we first had a political mandate that is established in our political framework of working climate change issues. Then we need to make a diagnosis of the current state of our NDC. We are in this process right now, and then the mission reference scenario update to continue a definition of adaptation priorities and goals, and review of mitigation measures and goals. And these are this last part is very important, and where we can see where ICAT project inputs are very important, because what we want to obtain in the implementation of the ICAT guideline is to reinforce the relationship between national and subnational governments, and to see if we can foster greater ambition. So then we see the NDC implementation plan, take the political decision, and we submit our NDC to the UNFCCC, to the convention. So just to clarify that we are very committed with the long-term strategy. Our president, Ivan Duque, say that, and it quotes him, dear delegates, our goal is to reach 2015 with great coalition that allows us to be carbon neutral. And to be that is really important to have this kind of allies with WRI and ICAT to understand where we can have this commitment to foster our ambition on the climate change issues. So Colombia is part of the Climate Change Alliance, and we're developing this long-term strategy. So talking about the project Emission overview, and I will be very quickly because I think my time is already over. The name of is the implementation of the ICAT's nonstate and subnational action guide. Our cooperators and allies are ICAT and WR Resource Institute, but our implementer here is WWF, which has very good experience with subnational and subnational non-state actors. It will take 7 months, maybe, this consultancy, and it will be close work with the consortium. We will focus, sorry. We will focus on the transport projects in cities. We establish with the people that are updating the NDC to transport to focus on this in this sector, because it's really important to be complemented with other allies and other projects that we are having right now on the NDC process update process, and also with the private initiative or non-state actors. We want to focus on that. And talking about subnational actors, we will focus on 2 states of Colombia, that is the Amazonian and Orinoquia state. These are 2 states very close to the Amazonia region, and those are states that are not covered by other projects. So we want to see how they contribute to NDC. So what we want to also about these specific objectives that are here present is also identify further opportunities, even in these subnational parts, and maybe to foster our ambition. So I hope this is very useful to you, and I think that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Santiago. You definitely have for time your presentation. We move now to Tom Sears from WRI. And as he loads up his presentation, if you've just recently joined us in the past 20 or so minutes, please find the agenda and the speakers for today embedded in the presentation in the dashboard to your right. So here you are, Tom. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Josh and Henning, and thank you to Cynthia and Santiago for the previous presentation. So I'll be discussing the America's Pledge example of the ICAT implementation, and specifically I'll be drilling down a little more deeply into this concept of integrating bottom-up climate actions with top-down emissions models, which was a key part of the America's Pledge process. So just for a quick context, America's Pledge has really been driving at 2 overarching questions. So we know that there is a lot of state and local level authority in the United States, and we know that a lot of actors have been stepping up in recent years. But a primary question is, what does this all add up to? And then within that, how large is the coalition of actors in terms of GDP or emissions footprint? And also, what is the impact of their actions on overall US emissions? And then the second question is, how can we do more? So what is the roadmap for expanded bottom-up action and policies? And what would the impact of these hypothetical expanded actions be on overall US emissions? So these two overarching questions have been at the heart of the America's Pledge Initiative, which is a collaboration between World Resources Institute, Rocky Mountain Institute, and the University of Maryland, with support from Bloomberg Philanthropies. And our findings have been published in a series of reports in 2017, 2018, and most recently in 2019 as well. So briefly touching on just the overall approach and the various components of the analysis for America's Pledge. So with the overarching goal of assessing the aggregate impacts of state, city, and business actions in the US, there were sort of three overall components here. The first is what we refer to as a sectoral analysis. So that's a bottom-up accounting of the potential impact of current policies and commitments. The second, a second component is what we refer to as economy-wide modeling. So that's using a top-down integrated assessment model, or IAM, for national emissions pathway. And then finally, sort of helping to tie all of this together is the process of scenario development. So using these bottom-up and top-down tools and their underlying data, scenarios sort of define the overall storyline that can meaningfully address the analytic questions. And at the heart of all of this is really how you integrate these bottom-up and top-down tools, which is referred to as top-down integration in the ICAT guide. So before going a little bit more deep into our process, I thought it would be helpful to step back and just give a quick overview of integrated assessment models more broadly. And apologies to those in the audience who are already familiar with these topics. But essentially, IAMs help answer what-if questions around climate and energy, and are used very widely to develop emissions pathways for a given country or region based on various assumptions. The advantage is that they can handle and represent very complex economic interactions over time and across sectors. There are a myriad of models that can be used to answer any number of questions, each with sort of different strengths and weaknesses. However, certain models have been used quite prominently in climate mitigation planning. So, for example, many of you are probably familiar with the LEAP model developed out of the Stockholm Environment Institute, and that's used by, I think, 32 countries and counting to create their emission scenarios that form the basis for their NDCs under the Paris Agreement. Another US-specific example is the Global Change Assessment Model, which the US government used in compiling its mid-century strategy, which was released in 2016, and illustrated pathways for achieving 80% economy-wide emissions reductions by 2050. So in part due to its prior use as a modeling tool in the US, and because of its 50-state resolution for the United States, the America's Pledge team used the Global Change Assessment Model, GCAM. So in addition to having a well-vetted, robust top-down model for US economy-wide emissions, we also, of course, compiled significant amounts of bottom-up data on subnational climate actions in the US in step with the recommendations of the ICAT guide. And I won't get into too much detail here, but the America's Pledge team went through a process of identifying a wide array of sector-specific actions taking place in the US that were sufficiently representative of sort of the broader scope of subnational action actually occurring, and that were also quantifiable. So that's a very important criteria, and we needed to make sure that the actions we were collecting information on had the data requirements we needed in order to plug them into our modeling process. So some examples of the types of actions we included in our process here renewable energy targets in the power sector, efficiency targets in the building sector, electric vehicle mandates in transportation, and also efforts to reduce non-CO2 emissions, such as HFC leaks or methane leaks from oil and gas systems. So all of these actions are taking place to varying degrees at state, city, and business levels. And we ended up being fairly extensive in our mapping, but this still leaves the question of then how do we integrate all of these actions into a national emissions trajectory? So the first step in our process that's illustrated here is to quantify the impacts sector by sector. And we used a bottom-up approach here, where we essentially developed a series of Excel-based tools, which we refer to as the Athena model. And each of these tools is sort of catered to the specific sector of actions and the overlap assumptions within that sector. However, they all follow the same general logic, which is first establishing a baseline projection for that actor without any action or policy taking place, establishing a projection for that actor with the action taking place, and then aggregating all of these actions together and accounting for overlaps. It's important to note that since we were using GCAM as our top-down model, we developed our reference case scenarios in part based on baseline data from GCAM, so that we calculated the impacts of subnational actions and then quantified that relative to GCAM's baseline before passing it back to the top-down model. So in summary, the impacts of these state, city, and business actions were quantified and then aggregated sector by sector and at the state level before being passed back to GCAM. Just providing a little bit more detail here on a really important step in the process, which is harmonizing metrics across the bottom-up and top-down modeling processes. So for each type of action, we needed to make sure that the metric that we're quantifying bottom-up can be compatible with the GCAM model. So just to take an example, for renewable energy targets, we may have quantified the impact of state and city and business renewable energy actions in terms of terawatt hours of renewable electricity demand, but needed to convert that into a percentage of total electricity load. Or for electric vehicles, we may have been quantifying the impact of zero-emission vehicle mandates in terms of resulting electric vehicle sales, but needed to convert that into electric vehicle miles traveled in order for GCAM to be able to interpret those impacts. And these were done at the state or sometimes at the grid level. And then an additional very vital part of this process is what we refer to as scenario development. So there are essentially a limitless number of options here, but the basic idea is to organize the modeling process such that it addresses meaningful questions for your audience. So for the Americas Pledge process, we had 3 scenarios. The first was a current measures scenario, which is essentially what happens if just only the current on the books subnational and national policies are achieved, but there's no future momentum. Then we developed what we called the bottom-up scenario, which is what happens if these actions are scaled up and there's further momentum at the subnational level. And then finally, there was an all-in scenario, which envisions even further scaling up of these actions through complementary federal policies. So for current measures, the process was essentially to model the impact of the policies that we quantified in the bottom-up process. And then for the bottom-up and all-in scenarios, we sort of looked at current most ambitious policies that were included in the current measures scenario, and so have been adopted at least by some actors in the US, and then sort of extrapolated and modeled those actions on a larger scale taking place across the country. So some of the examples of these high ambition actions would be renewable electricity standards of at least 60% by 2030, or building efficiency standards that yield 2% energy savings per year. And then finally, these assumptions by scenario on the impact of subnational policies are combined with additional assumptions that are sort of more standard inputs to a integrated assessment model. So for example, population and GDP growth, fossil fuel prices, renewable technology costs, and all of that is integrated together so that we have a combination of policy and technical economic assumptions. And here you can see sort of the central estimate results of that process. So our current measure scenario is in the red here and resulted in a 25% reduction by 2030 from a 2005 baseline. The bottom-up scenario in the blue would get to a 37% reduction, and then the all-in scenario would get to a 49% reduction. So the goal here was to show a US trajectory that reflects subnational actions. And so we used US-based tools and data sources. However, the implication here is that this is sort of a general framework that could be applied in other country contexts as well. So really quickly, just to summarize, the key challenge here is that integrated assessment models like GCAM and LEAP are very well suited for developing national emissions trajectories based on broad technical and economic assumptions. However, they don't have the resolution to readily include subnational and non-state actions. And so the impacts, our approach was to aggregate these actions bottom up and convert into appropriate metrics to then be applied to the top-down model. Key steps in this process are all steps that are sort of included in the ICAT guidance at various stages. And finally, it's important to highlight that there are limitations to this process. So integrated assessment models result in scenarios, which of course are inherently uncertain, and they do answer valuable questions. But I think the other preceding steps in the ICAT guide are also extremely useful and also answer important questions for policymakers, such as conducting a landscape analysis or compiling a list of all subnational actions taking place. So I'll stop there and look forward to questions at the end of the webinar here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was a very nice presentation. So from the US, we're going to move over to India, where Ashwini is presenting on behalf of Indian businesses. So please take it away, Ashwini.
Hi everyone, thank you Josh, and thank you to all our previous speakers here. I'm very happy to be here to briefly take you all through the application of the nonstate and subnational action guidance here in India. As one of the pilots, we use the nonstate and subnational action guidance to assess the impact of voluntary climate initiatives by non-state actors, specifically the corporate sector in India. This pilot was conducted in partnership with the Confederation of Indian Industry, which is also known as CII, and they led the data collection and analysis for this piece of work. So like I mentioned, the objective of the guide was to provide feedback on the draft in terms of how the application can be improved across different geographies, and also to, for the first time, assess the impact of voluntary initiatives, like I mentioned, and do that at an aggregate level and see how they compare with national emission trajectories. So to begin with, and as a background to our global audience here, India is the third largest emitter of greenhouse gases as a developing country, which is yet to lift out millions from poverty and to build basic infrastructure. India's absolute emissions are expected to increase and continue rising in the coming years. Yet, India has set ambitious commitments internationally as well as domestically. In India's nationally determined contributions, India has committed to reducing its emission intensity of GDP by 33 to 35% by 2030, and this is in comparison with 2005 levels. Similarly, India has also committed to having 40% of its installed power from non-fossil fuel sources. Apart from these NDCs, India also has a target of 175 gigawatt renewable power by 2022, and recently also expressed the intention to ramp up the total renewables to 450 gigawatt. As part of meeting its targets, India has implemented a number of policies, which include the Energy Efficiency Cap Trade Scheme, which is also called as the Perform, Achieve and Trade, which is PAT, renewable purchase obligations and renewable energy certifications to meet these obligations. It also has implemented an implicit price on carbon, which is also in the form of a coal cess, which taxes every ton of coal consumed, and the funds that were collected as part of this were intended to support clean energy through viability gap funding. Apart from these key initiatives, India also has implemented programs such as energy efficiency billing codes, standards and labeling, accelerated depreciation for investments in renewables, all of which contribute to emission reductions. However, India's mitigation policy remains a centrally driven directive, while states are expected to implement these policies and also develop their own climate change action plans. These are typically more focused on climate adaptation rather than mitigation. India's industry sector, on the other hand, is one of the fastest growing in the world. It already constitutes more than 50% of India's energy demand as well as electricity consumption. It contributed to 21% of total direct emissions, which does not account for the electricity consumption I mentioned. And these emissions have grown at almost 9% annually between 2005 and 2013. Yet, Indian businesses are, especially the large ones, have been at the forefront of climate action, with 51 companies either already pricing carbon or planning to do so. Until now, 41 Indian companies have committed to science-based targets, of which 13 have already set science-based targets which are approved. And apart from this, Indian companies are committed to increasing their share of renewable energy as well as energy efficiency. So with this background, we decided to assess the aggregate impact of voluntary climate initiatives by Indian businesses using the ICAT guide. So this figure here gives a simplified overview of how we applied this guidance to achieve the objective I just mentioned. The first step involves defining the scope and the voluntary actions that we would like to include in this assessment. It also involves selection of the relevant actions by the companies within the scope of assessment. This step also involves identification of relevant policies and regulations that impact the emissions from the companies selected. So some of the examples include the Perform, Achieve and Trade policies, or the RDCs that I mentioned earlier, which will impact some of these companies and their actions thereof. The overall impact is then assessed as a net impact of these companies over and above the emissions without considering voluntary actions, which is also the business as usual scenario. This business as usual scenario includes the impact of policies and mandates, improvements in grid mix over a period of time, as well as improvements due to impact of policy, impact of technology upgradation over a period. All of these would result in reductions irrespective of whether companies have voluntary actions or not. And hence we take the net effect of the voluntary initiatives over and above this business scenario. We also take into consideration the likelihood that these companies will achieve the targets that they have set, and this is based on the progress they have made on their initiatives so far. Finally, the study also compares the aggregate impact of these 50 of the companies with the national projections. So in terms of the scope and boundary, we started with 150 companies which were part of the CII Greenco initiative. And we also looked at the top 200 companies by market capitalization under the Bombay Stock Exchange. Among all of these countries, in order to accurately and reliably be able to assess the mitigation impact, we chose companies that fulfilled all the above, all the three criteria listed here. One, which is they have some GHG inventorization over the last 3 years. They have verified Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, which is direct and indirect emissions, and they have a quantifiable and time-bound target, which leads to emission reductions. Accordingly, we have a short list of 50 companies that were then included in our analysis. As you can see here, these 50 companies here represent various sectors from the Indian industry. Overall, they add up to 204 million tons of CO2, which makes up almost 35% of India's industry sector emissions as of 2014. Looking at the overall initiatives that the companies have taken, as you can see here, we have a heterogeneous mix of targets and timelines as well as the type of targets. So as you can see here, a majority of targets that Indian companies have taken are intensity targets. At the same time, we have 8% of companies which are absolute targets and some that have neutrality targets as well, carbon neutrality targets. Target years also differ across countries. Companies, while some have year-on-year targets, a lot of companies have targets that probably end this year, which is 2020, while some have targets that extend up to 2030. Again, baseline years differ for each of these companies because their targets are dependent on the baseline years. So one of the key steps is again to look at the differences in these baseline and target types and try to rationalize them across common metrics. Some of the key assumptions that we use for our analysis also included defining the business as usual scenario, which I mentioned earlier. So this includes two components. One is how the emission intensity or emissions grow over a period of time. And for this, we used the company's own projections, the projections that the company has on its production and growth. We also have taken into consideration sectoral projections as well as the company's past growth rate. And as a matter of priority and preference, we've prioritized them in the order that I've showcased here. In terms of the emission reductions that happen over a period of time, again, as a business as usual scenario, we expect at least 2.85% reduction year on year, which is based on a historical analysis over the past 25 years. And over and above this, we also apply policy mandates that the companies that are relevant to the companies like ICAT and other policies. In terms of the ambition level beyond the target years mentioned, so some companies have targets only that only extend up to 2020. We have extended these, assuming the same level of ambition beyond the target year. That is, if a company's target ends in 2020, we assume that the same level of ambition will continue until 2030 because our assessment goes up to 2030. And finally, in terms of the likelihood of target achievement, here we assume companies would either fall into one of these three categories. One is that they are likely to meet their targets, in which case we account for 100% of the target achievement and the emission reductions thereof. It's also likely that these companies won't meet their targets because they haven't made any progress so far, and that again a subjective and judgment call that we've made based on their performance, in which case we still account for 25% of the overall target. And somewhere in between, we have 25% achievement where we assume that these companies will meet their target to some extent, but may not be able to meet them completely. Using this analysis and the assumptions that I mentioned here, what we see here is that these 50 companies that we have assessed could lead to almost 6 to 12% of emission reductions in terms of absolute numbers relative to their own business as usual emissions, and this is across the years 2020 to 2030. When we compare this to the national emissions, and we do that using 4 different models available by different organizations and modeling agencies, we see that the emission reductions in absolute terms again adds up to around 1.3 to 1.6% of India's overall emissions. So just to reiterate, 50 Indian companies can contribute to almost 1.5% of emission reductions by 2030. Compared to India's national emissions. Some of the challenges that we faced in this is one, that India does not have a mandatory reporting program for companies. So data as such is not as easily available for all of the non-state actors or industry sector per se, and which is why we chose to go through for the largest companies using the 2 data sets that we have and that are publicly available. Having said that, these are highly correlated with the companies that are most likely to have this kind of data, and there is a very little chance that we might have missed a company that has data but is sort of or has target and we've not included. At the same time, over a period of time, if this kind of analysis has to be conducted, there needs to be better data from companies. Heterogeneity of targets and baseline again is something that will come up because these are voluntary initiatives and they differ based on company's own preference and scenario. Again, the guidance provides steps for being able to rationalize these numbers and to bring them to a common metric. In terms of the policy impacts that we have been able to account for, we've been able to account for only the policies that have a direct quantitative impact that can be attributed to that particular policy because we're doing a company-level analysis. However, there are some policies like the accelerated depreciation or other such schemes which may not be able to be quantified at a company level in terms of how much of the emission reduction might be caused or what kind of overlap is there with other policies. And that is something that's probably more feasible with a more modeling kind of an approach. And finally, there's always this uncertainty with respect to the business as usual scenario, where we've made assumptions on where we think the company might be and how the impact then sort of features. The business as usual scenario itself is built on a set of assumptions and which when differed can also lead to different results. Accordingly, in our overall analysis, we've also included certain scenarios where we look at how the impacts would change if the business as usual scenario changes. And accordingly, we see that the results largely stay in similar range, if not exactly the same. And yet, I mean, in spite of all these challenges, some of the very important questions that such analysis can answer is what kinds of initiatives are undertaken by these kind of actors, what data is required, and which is again an indication of how data collection and analysis can be improved over time, which sectors are driving reductions. Like, for example, in our case, we saw the most energy intensive sectors were the ones driving emission reductions. And finally, what policies are able to encourage accelerated reduction. In terms of how such an analysis can help policymakers, it will help them understand what is the contribution of these kind of actors in meeting national targets, which sectors need greater incentives or support, and how NDCs can be enhanced, given that there is now some knowledge and indication of the potential from non-state actions. And finally, what new avenues can be created for better coordination. And this is, again, like I said, this has never been done in India before, and we hope that this is the first step, and hopefully with the launch of the guidance, there'll be better analysis and newer analysis across different non-state and subnational actions in India. So with that, I can stop here, and I'll be happy to answer questions that come in. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashwini, and I hope everyone found that presentation very valuable. We're moving quickly to Swithin, who's presenting the innovative tool from New Climate Institute. Thanks, Swithin.
Hi, thanks, Josh, and thanks for all the previous presenters. I will try to be very brief. I'm speaking on behalf of the New Climate Institute, who helped out on was the lead author on the ICAT guidance, as well as some previous non-state actor aggregation reports, the global climate action from cities, regions, and businesses. I will focus on a sneak peek of this ICAT non-state action tool, which is an accessible Excel-based tool, macro-enabled, that basically implements the ICAT NSA guide that Cynthia and Henning introduced. And the use cases are broad, but were very well illustrated by the previous presenters, both for America's Pledge, Colombia, and India. This tool is built to allow analysts and other stakeholders to basically implement this guidance and conduct their own non-state action analysis. Just a sneak peek into the tool, which is currently being prepared for review in coming weeks. So the first thing I want to draw your attention to is this toolbar up here, which mimics the chapters and sections in the non-state action guidance so that users can basically have the guidance side by side and implement an analysis with this tool according to the same alignment of sections. The tool starts off with part one, which is the introduction, and it basically gives some functions of the tool components, gives you important notes on basically which instructions you should continue with, identifying your purpose of the tool, and then also introduces some key principles that are also in the ICAT guidance. For defining the assessment, Cynthia had previously displayed this hypothetical example in box 4.1 on this left panel. And this tool allows and enables the user to do exactly this in a very friendly user form, as you see on the right. These are just a snapshot panel of what is in each of these sheets, but the sheets are much more elaborated. But users can essentially go down this decision tree and select which assessment objectives, which sectors they want to analyze, what actor groups, action types, etc. And based on the decisions made by the users, the tool will adapt and provide guidance on how to proceed next. And will also kind of check that the purpose of your objectives can be fulfilled with the entries that you input. In another part of the assessment, users can also use this tool to input targets and non-state actions. You can do this in two ways in the tool. You could either follow this left method, which is a one-by-one user input, and this is a very heavily guided process where you can implement different types of targets and declare different types of entries. And what is not shown here is that there's also extensive info buttons alongside each section to help users input the correct information. And this will all feed into this large actions list overview page on the right, where users can also input data directly. This is, we put multiple methods there because some users will be very familiar already with the format of the guidance and format of the data needed. And in that case, they could just copy and paste batch data into the right for greater efficiency. And all these sheets are also filled with data validation. So if you input kind of incorrect targets, such as if you input your target year, which is below your base year or something like this, the Excel sheets will respond and pop up with errors and give you more guidance. So it's really implemented in a user-friendly way. This sheets in the national pathways also allows you to input scenario data, such as those implemented by our previous presenters. And this part is available if you have chosen to do a top-down integration. Basically, if your assessment objective fits this, and you can declare different types of scenarios. You can have a reference scenario, but also include some mitigation scenarios such as current policies or NDC, or even 2-degree pathway, whichever you like. And you can declare your sector information, fill out your latest inventory year. This could be according to UNFCCC submissions or whichever inventories you wish. And the tool will basically guide you throughout, and you could input your data. It'll calculate some sector splits for you. And if you look at the first top left panel, it'll also guide you in terms of, it'll prompt you whether you want to use which scenarios for growth rate assumptions and stuff like this. In the impact assessment, we have taken the liberty to implement a lot of brain power into the tool. So basically, we have these aggregation and overlap calculations that will do all the calculations for you and spit out results. These aggregation calculations are based off of methodologies that have been peer-reviewed and are submitted, published in Climate Policy Journal with our team. And so they've been kind of robustly validated for. And the overlap calculations as well has been used in our last reports and is also currently forthcoming in a submission for peer-reviewed articles. These are locked, but are open for users that are interested. We will provide a technical annex along with the tool for those that wish to kind of understand more of the math and the assumptions taken behind the impact assessments. For the reporting results, we also both report results for you in terms of the impact of non-state action across your reference scenario. And we also present landscape analysis results. These are automatically generated for your convenience, and you are able to basically toggle different years or different sectors depending on what types of data you want to see. These are visuals that we have that we think are the most useful, but users are also available to take the statistics out of the tool and make their own visuals or, different, modify the colors and whatnot. And what is forthcoming is this reporting sheet that will basically, in line with the ICAT guidance, it will extract all the key information from your assessment, starting from your assessment boundary all the way to your data inputs, all the way to the results, and it'll extract this into an easy summarizing form that you can download and save in different formats, with the idea that you can attach this to a report or a paper that you wish to write to summarize the results for your convenience. We also have extensive kind of bookkeeping aspects to this tool. So you can input your sources here. What I did not show you in the national pathways is you could also use different parts of the sheet to basically input assumptions or policies that are integrating your scenarios. There's a large bookkeeping aspect to this too. And we have also taken liberty to fill in some public access data on GDP and population in case it is your priority to develop scenarios that you do not yet have. And yeah, that's a brief snapshot into the tool. It was quite quick and we could go deeper into it, but feel free to contact me or any of my colleagues if you have any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Swithin, very much. So, and I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of the presenters for their time and their expertise, and hopefully this webinar has been extremely valuable for you. As you might have noticed, we have gone over the time. It's just an indication of all the kind of valuable content that we did want to bring you in order to support you with your understanding of the ICAT Assessment Guide for Non-State Action and Subnational Actions. For the Q&A session, we're going to pivot slightly. We're going to carry on the conversation. Your questions have been rolling in, and we've been dividing those up among the speakers. And what we're going to do is keep the conversation going offline. As you can see, all the presenters are eager to answer your questions. But for the sake of time, what we're going to do is answer your questions offline. So please take the next minute and either lodge them in the dashboard to your right, or I'm just going to put up an email address up there on the screen, icat@unops.org. Please share your questions. Take this time to share those questions from all of the speakers. And we're going to answer those and get back to everybody with those answers. We really do appreciate your understanding on this, that we won't have an interactive Q&A session, but nevertheless, all your questions that you have asked so far and over the coming time will be answered. On that note, it is the sad part of the webinar where we do wrap up. So I'd like to draw your attention to the upcoming webinars of this series on forestry, renewable energy and transport pricing. You can register for those at climateactiontransparency.org. Make sure when you are there to sign up for email updates. And that's one way where we can contact you with, for example, these Q&As. And make sure you follow us on Twitter at ICAT Climate. So thank you so much for joining us. Again, please fill out the evaluation form so we can improve this webinar and continue delivering these knowledge sharing pieces of webinars with you in the future. So thank you again to all our speakers, and thank you to you. Enjoy your afternoon or your morning, and we'll see you at the next webinar. Goodbye.